Well, it's amazing how we think we know what we know. It's equal amazing how many times we prefer not to be confused with the facts, especially if those facts contradict what we know we know. Some of the worst wars in history have been fought when Christians knew what they knew, even though it was wrong. We do it all the time. I mean, the scriptures are thousands upon thousands of years old. And so they're open to interpretation. They've been translated several times. And, well, you know, what can you say? We know what we know, but we don't. In his book, Shiny Gods, the Reverend Mike Slaughter makes an interesting observation about this. You know, many Christians today, if you ask them, will tell you that the reason that we're faithful, the reason that we live a faith-filled life is to make it to heaven, right? We want to live in eternity with God, which is a good plan, but that's not exactly what the scriptures are all about. The scriptures make it very plain that God is interested in the way that we live today. God wants us to have a good life, a life filled with purpose and meaning, a life that helps make life for others better. As a matter of fact, did you know that the Bible has more to say about all of the practical dimensions of life than it does about heaven? Reverend Slaughter says that Jesus didn't announce, "I came that you may go to heaven." He said, "I came that you may have life, and have life abundantly." When we approach the scriptures with an open mind, when we realize that they still have much to teach us, then we find amazing things. We find directives on how to live a God-filled life, a life filled with purpose and meaning here and now. And one of the first steps in claiming that life is to understand that we were created to be a channel through which God's blessings can flow into the world. The challenge, of course, is that almost from the very beginning, humans have had difficulty trusting. We have difficulty trusting promises that have yet to come true. We have promises trusting that even in times of scarcity, God is there and will provide for us. But the promise that God made is true. And it's not only that there will be enough for us. The promise says that if we share what little we have with others, there will be more than enough for everyone. In today's reading from the book of Leviticus, it's not we Christians' favorite book because it's filled with laws. But Leviticus was given to the Israelites when they were still in the wilderness. One thing about humans is our past directly affects the way that we tend to relate to the present and the way we make plans for the future. And the Israelites had a hard past. The Egyptians were not kind people. And so their lives had been filled with scarcity and with disappointment and grief. But the scriptures tell us an interesting thing. That when the people cried out, God heard their cries. In the midst of all of what was going on, it seems as though therefore for several generations they must have forgotten who they were. Because it wasn't until they cried out, until they remembered that God came to them. And when God came to them, God said, "It's going to be okay. I am going to lead you you into the land flowing with milk and honey. And the Israelites believed, at least for a while. And they saw spectacular things. They won their freedom. But our past influences who we are in the present, right? And so the only thing they knew was scarcity. And their first impulse was to grab everything they could. They wanted to grab what they needed. They wanted to grab more than they needed. They wanted to hoard everything just in case God's promise didn't come true. Remember what happened when God sent them the manna? Very clear instructions. They thought they were going to starve to death in the wilderness, and God comes to them and says, it's going to be okay. Every fresh morning you will have manna to eat. You are to pick up just enough for that day. No more, unless it is the Sabbath. And then you may pick up 2 days' worth. But what was the first thing that happened? That first day they came out of their dwelling places and they looked on the ground and they said, what is that? Because the ground was covered with a white substance they never saw before. And Moses said, pick it up, eat it. And for 40 years, God sent them that manna. But on that first day, what happened? They grabbed more than they needed. They took as much as they could. They hoarded it in their tents. They put it in jars. And it was a disaster. It rotted. There were worms. It was sour. And Moses said, I told you, don't do that. God will provide. Just take what you need and nothing else. 40 years it worked. But the day they crossed over into that promised land, there was no more manna. They didn't need it anymore. They had crossed over into a land that would provide them with everything they needed. And so God said, it's up to you now. But God knew exactly what they were going to do because our past influences our present. He knew that the first thing they were going to do when they entered that land was they were going to grab everything they could. They were going to hoard everything possible. And God said, don't. Clear back in Leviticus, so that they could get it into their minds, he told them what they were to do. When you harvest your grain, always leave some of it standing around the edges of your fields, and don't pick up what falls on the ground. Don't strip your grain vines clean or gather the grapes that fall off the vines. Leave them for the poor and the immigrants who will be among you. In other words, they were to remember that any blessing they received, including a harvest that had followed a season of very hard work, everything was a gift from God. It was a gift that was to be shared with others. And it was to be shared with love and concern and compassion. You see, it is God's nature to give and to give abundantly. And if we want to live a God-filled life, if we want to be contented and fulfilled in everything that we do, we too must be willing to give and give abundantly. So why are we so hesitant to obey? Could it be that we listen to society more than we listen to God? Have we convinced ourselves there really isn't enough? Therefore, we must save towards that proverbial rainy day. It sounds good. And saving is good. But the problem is that we're not saving. We are, however, hoarding. We're taking everything we can get, everything we want, everything that catches our eyes, even if it means using credit and going into debt. We want it. But we know the minute we drive the car off the lot, it's depreciated in value. We know the minute we walk out of the store with that brand new computer or phone, it's outdated. And so we have to grab for some more. And we have to grab for some more. And we have to keep grabbing because there's always something new, something better than what we have. That's not saving. It's not saving. It's taking more than we need. And in the process, we deny others of having what they need. You know, even though we have many good reasons, the point is that, well, we've been doing this since, well, did you hear the disciples? In today's gospel reading, they were confronted with a challenge. It was dinner time. There were 5,000 people. Now, note, nowhere does it say there were 5,000 hungry people. All it tells us is it was supper time. The hour was late. And so the disciples go to Jesus and basically says, get rid of them. They need to go home. And they use an excuse. What is the excuse? They're hungry. We don't have enough food to feed them. But Jesus isn't buying it. Jesus says, so how much food do you have? Funny thing, they hadn't checked. They just assumed there was no food. And Jesus says, go find out. Find out what you have and then come talk to me. And so they come triumphantly to him. At least that's what I imagine when I read that story. You know, 5,000 people, here's what we have. A few loaves of bread and 2 fish. And they grin at Jesus. Now you'll send them home, right? And Jesus says, feed them. And while they're standing there shocked, Jesus blesses the bread and breaks the fish and hands them back exactly what they had given him. And he says, no excuses. Go do it. And what happens? When they place the bread in Jesus' hands, when they have done what they can do, and leave the rest of it up to the Lord, miracles happen. The people are fed. It wouldn't have happened if Jesus had bought into their excuse. According to Reverend Slaughter, Jesus doesn't accept our excuses either. He doesn't want to hear about what we don't have or wish we had, any more than he accepted the disciples' excuse. He asks us, how many loaves do you have? Don't focus on what you want or on your limitations. Look at what God has given you and quit complaining about it. Go and see what God has provided. When the disciples did it, when they went and found what God had already provided, when they trusted Jesus enough just to do what he said, they went out and they were part of a miracle. There was enough There was more than enough. God blesses, we give. This is the design of creation, and it is the only way to live the good life, a life filled with God's Spirit. To God be the glory, and all God's children say,